So good evening and welcome to tonight's lecture. I'm Paul Whalen, chairman of the Sir John Soane's Museum Foundation, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Bruce Boucher, the Deborah Loeb Bryce Director of Sir John Soane's Museum in London. But first I want to thank Jonathan Hogg, the chair of our programs committee, and Bill Appleton for bringing us together this evening. But especially I want to thank Alex and Jean Sloan, who are two of the people who are there, and there they are, for goodness sakes. Sorry to call attention to you. Yeah. I think my watch is fast. Yeah. We're here because Alex and Jean have invited us to their beautiful club. Thank you. That was well timed. Bruce Boucher is an art historian and curator specializing in Renaissance and Baroque sculpture and architecture. He studied at Harvard University, at Oxford University, the Courtauld Institute of Art. He is professor emeritus at University College London, where he taught for over 20 years. Before joining the Soane Museum, Bruce was director of the Fralin Museum of Art at the University of Virginia, which followed a role as curator and head of European sculpture, decorative arts, and ancient art at the Art Institute, Chicago. He is former president of the board of the Center for Palladian Studies in America and currently a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. Bruce became director of the Soane Museum in May 2016 and has become a dear friend of all of the Soane Foundation members and myself personally. We were delighted that he and Diane were with us in New York for our gala last week, and I'm thrilled at the prospect of their joining us for our tour of Northern Italy in the spring. Yay. That's going to come out within a week or so in our, on our website. Following the lecture, by the way, I invite all of you to join us for drinks. We're going to have half an hour or so of just a quick drink and to talk about what Bruce said. Did we agree? Did we disagree? It all comes out with the liquor. So please welcome Bruce Boucher.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. It's great to be back here with the foundation and also at the Union Club, where I've lectured on several occasions. So it's like old home week. My talk tonight comes from the last chapter of my book on John Soane as a collector, which will be published by Yale University Press this spring. And while I was writing it, it raised a number of issues which had lain, I suppose, in the back of my mind for a number of years. And the title of my talk comes from an article which was published in an influential journal of architecture in England called The Builder. You see it on the screen now as it was pasted into the minutes of the meetings of the trustees of Sir John Soane's Museum. Published in 1859, the article took stock of the museum 20 years after it opened to the public, and it made some rather pointed comments. And I'll read you a few sentences. The remarkable architectural museum, collections, and library left to the nation by the late Sir John Soane should be made of greater service to the nation than it has yet been. His desire was to benefit the public to the utmost, and until architects and the public have the utmost possible benefit from his noble endowment, his desire will not be fulfilled. The museum is visited by hundreds instead of thousands. The books and drawings are safe and untouched, carefully locked up and useless. There is a locked-up air indeed about the whole house. Visitors, when they've obtained a card and gained admittance, feel that they are there on sufferance, and would no more think of asking for a case or drawer to be opened than they would in any private house to which they'd gained access by courtesy of the proprietor to glance at the pictures. And you may just be able to make out at the foot of the page some handwritten notes which were penned by George Bailey, who was the first curator. But nonetheless, the comparison that the builder makes in this article with a private house is noteworthy because it underscores the ambivalent nature of a house museum, one that was intended to serve the public as a public resource. The article concluded by asking the trustees and curator to reconsider the opening hours and to let the public more fully enjoy its own. This was neither the first nor the last such criticism aimed at what had been conceived by Sir John Soane in a spirit of public munificence, and it begs the question, how could this have come about? To answer, one must return to the history of the house and collection in its owner's lifetime. And here we see John Soane in 1804, really at probably the height of his personal happiness, looking forward to a succession of an architectural dynastic family with his two sons, and of course on the right, a view into the dome area looking towards the Apollo Belvedere. At the end of his 6th Royal Academy lecture on architecture in January 1812, Soane announced that his house would be open to students of the Academy on the day before and the day after his lectures. He did this so that the drawings, plaster casts, and architectural fragments alluded to in his text would be available for consultation. Already by this date, Soane began to contemplate the public-facing role his collection could play in what was already being referred to as an Academy of Architecture. Soane was also aware of the fact that a number of aristocratic collections in London and elsewhere were open to the public for inspection. In 1809, John Britton, an antiquarian friend of Soane's and sometime ally, presented him with a copy of his guidebook to Corsham House in Wiltshire, which included a catalogue of its picture collection. Published in 1806, that book was one of a line of publications extending back to the first half of the 18th century. And among these books, which were celebrations of houses and collections, was another published by Britton, the Catalogue Raisonné of the Marquis of Stafford's picture collection at Cleveland House in London, which had appeared in 1808. And Cleveland House, before the creation of the National Gallery, really was a kind of de facto National Gallery in London. In the introduction to his catalogue of the Marquis of Stafford's picture collection, Britton explained the laudable motive for making such collections accessible was for the melioration of society and the expansion of the human intellect. This was a common enough gesture on the part of aristocratic and merely wealthy collectors, and here we are looking at an example of a notable collection of the period, Charles Townley's house in Park Street in the West End of London, which eventually found its way to the museum in a bequest in 1806. In Soane's case, a critical factor behind his magnanimity was the death of his wife Eliza in 1815, and the bitter disappointment he felt over the careers of his two sons, John and George. The younger John initially followed in his father's footsteps and became an architect, although his heart wasn't in it. And he predeceased his father in 1823. George, whom we see here sitting on the ground, saw himself as a man of the theater as well as a man of letters, but he ended up alienating his father through a series of public and private attacks. Thus, like many collectors, John Soane lavished his attention and affection upon his house and collection, which became, in effect, his children and heirs. The rapid expansion of Soane's collection in the 1820s led to an elaborate volume overseen again by his friend John Britton. It was called The Union of Architecture, Sculpture, and Painting, exemplified by the house and galleries of John Soane, and it appeared in 1827. And here we're seeing the frontispiece of the illustration opposite the frontispiece to the book, which shows characteristically a very complicated view of the monk's parlor, looking into the monk's parlor, and in the distance we see a mirror reflecting the stained glass windows effectively behind where we would be standing if we were standing in this image. Correspondence between Britton and Soane indicates that this was a joint project for an elaborate illustrated folio volume dedicated to the house and collection, and it was underway as early as 1824. Britton wrote Soane that he hoped to produce a very interesting and curious volume, and one that will perpetuate your name when your buildings are leveled to the dust. The narrative was composed by a journalist named Leeds, although the messaging was clearly Soane's, and Soane advanced the notable sum of £550 for the publication. In the event, it was the project rather than Soane's buildings that crumbled first. The deluxe folio volume sank under its own weight. Britton had to reduce the price of the volumes, which still did not sell, and the two men fell out over the cost for a number of years until Soane finally reimbursed Britton for all his expenses in 1835. However cumbersome Britton's union of architecture, sculpture, and painting proved, its subtext was clear. Architects needed a national academy to raise their standing above that of ordinary builders. Whereas the British Museum contained few architectural fragments from classical antiquity, and the Royal Academy did not accord architecture significant recognition, Soane's collection sought to rectify that situation. As an assemblage of architectural fragments and models, the collection was trumpeted by John Britton as unrivaled in Great Britain, setting an example that deserves to be adopted by the government, i.e. that the government should create a national academy for architecture. And here I'm showing you two watercolors, one on the left of the museum corridor, as it's called, in 1825, just after the creation of the picture room, which shows you this very dense collection of architectural elements. We're staring in the center at the Capitol and the entablature of the Temple of Castor and Pollux in Rome. And on the right, we're looking at one of Soane's lecture drawings of the same Capitol in situ with an architectural student perilously mounting a ladder to try to take measurements. I juxtapose these two to illustrate the fact that these plaster casts were as valuable in Soane's day as going to see the originals, because for much of Soane's career you couldn't go to see the originals because of the Napoleonic Wars. It was difficult to get to Italy. So for Soane and for his pupils, this was a great reference library. Britton also commented upon the deployment of color, stained glass, mirrors, and vistas, which were dealt with in some detail, all reflecting the genius of their creator in combining architecture, sculpture, and painting in a beautiful ensemble. Mirrors are, of course, one of the most conspicuous features in the house and museum proper. They are especially conspicuous in the breakfast room, which we see here, one of the most admired and imitated spaces in the building, later described by Soane himself in the following words: "The views from this room into the Monument Court," which is on our right in this image, and into the museum, which he means back in behind the window on the left looking into the galleries, into the museum, the mirrors in the ceiling and the looking glasses, combined with the variety of outline and general arrangement in the design and decoration of this limited space, present an almost infinite succession of those fanciful effects which constitute the poetry of architecture. Unhappy with Britton's work, Soane set out to remedy its defects in what would become 3 successive editions of his guidebook, which was entitled A Description of the House and Museum on the North Side of Lincoln's Inn Fields, which first appeared in 1830. And here we're looking at one of the lithographs of the 1830 edition. Privately printed, the book was intended for distribution to libraries, societies, and influential people. Of the copies printed, 250 were in the first edition of 1830, 106 were printed in 1832, of which half had a French translation to give it a kind of international cachet, and 150 were printed of a final expanded version across 1835 and 1836. The narrative was more succinct and much closer to a guidebook intended to accompany a visit to the house, with plans, elevations, and 17 plates to illustrate the main rooms, such as here we're looking into the dining room of the library dining room as it appeared in 1830. The book also imposed a sens de visite, which was clockwise in the first two editions and then anti-clockwise in the third. The purpose of the description is clearly stated in Soane's introduction. The objects of this work are chiefly to trace by reference to the figures on the geometrical plans the relative situation of the several rooms and communications in this house and museum, to notice some of the principal works of ancient and modern art, and lastly, to show by graphic illustration the connection between painting, sculpture, and architecture. Now, throughout the various editions, provenance and the aesthetic effects of the rooms and their contents prevailed over any detailed analysis of the collection, which Soane termed in general words as the powerful effects of architectural scenery. In the second edition of 1832, Soane announced that the House Museum and Library would be open 2 days a week during several months in the year for amateurs and students. After his death, the property would descend to his grandson, John Soane, also called John Soane, with sufficient funds to enable him to maintain and use the house, museum, and library in the same manner as during my lifetime. If, as indeed happened, his grandson died without a male heir, then the whole would be vested in the executors of Soane's will and administered until a national establishment exclusively for the instruction of students in the theory and practice of architecture, that is, a National Academy of Architecture, should be established, something that never happened, in fact. Events took a different turn in any case in the following year, 1833, with the establishment of the House and Collections as a national museum by Act of Parliament. This occurred not without controversy, as many considered Soane's decision to cut off his younger son George and George's children as unnatural. But Soane prevailed. Left hanging in the air, however, were the further questions of the purpose and functioning of such a museum after the lifetime of Sir John. In the summer of 1835, Soane dispatched multiple copies of the description across the United Kingdom and beyond. And in the 1835 edition, he appears, as it were, in an engraving of his bust by his friend Francis Chantrey. This is the first time that his name is mentioned in the book itself. Soane dispatched multiple copies of this final edition of the description across the United Kingdom and beyond. Interestingly, he kept a list of recipients of the book and also transcriptions of their thank you notes. Among others, copies were sent to the King and Queen, the Princess Victoria and her mother, the Duchess of Kent, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London, the libraries of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the kings of Saxony and Bavaria, the Emperor of Austria and Prince Metternich and Prince Esterhazy. Various academies in France and Belgium received a copy, as did the governor of the Bank of England, where Soane had been employed for 45 years, and the president of the Royal Academy. Again, Soane was a member of the Royal Academy for most of his adult life. And even the newly installed United States minister, Andrew Stevenson, was favored with a copy. In addition, Soane sent copies to old friends as well as fellow Royal Academicians and architects, including Charles Barry, the painter William Beechey, sculptor Francis Chantrey, Charles Eastlake, and Richard Westmacott. It was one of his last official actions on behalf of his bequest to the nation. And here we're looking at another of the engravings, of course, of the picture room, looking into the picture room recess. And you'll notice that there are the Anglo-Indian ivory chairs and table as centerpieces of the room, with his most expensive Greek vase balanced on the table. Probably this never occurred, but he wanted to put a lot of his best chefs-d'oeuvre in the image, so to beef it up, as it were. Soane died in January of 1837, and in his will he appointed George Bailey, whom we met, or whom I referred to at the beginning, his long-serving assistant, as curator, and Sally Conduit, his housekeeper since 1816, to serve under Bailey as inspectress. Soane was thus institutionalizing a hierarchy already in place in his household during his later years. The Act of Parliament of 1833 vested number 12 and 13 Lincoln's Inn Fields in trustees, who were instructed to give free access to the public, at least on 2 days in every week throughout the months of April, May, and June, and at such other times as the said trustees shall direct, to amateurs and students in painting, sculpture, and architecture, for consulting and inspecting and benefiting by the said collection. The trustees and their successors, the Act of Parliament continued, shall not, except in the case of absolute necessity, suffer the arrangement in which the said museum shall be left to be altered. There was provision for an endowment of £30,000, which was, again, unprecedented for such an establishment. And in addition, the rent from number 12, which was the first house that Soane had built on the north side of Lincoln's Inn Field and kept in his possession, the rent from number 12 would create, together with the £30,000, an income of approximately £1,100 a year to support the running of the museum. Unwittingly, however, Soane was here setting up problems that successive curators and trustees grappled with over the next century and a half. The original trustees were friends and associates, including the sculptor Francis Chantry, who was a long-standing confidant and a power within the Royal Academy. 4 additional trustees were appointed to 5-year terms, representing bodies of which Soane had been a fellow. These included the Royal Society, the Royal Academy, the Society of Antiquaries, and the Society of Arts. And 1 trustee also represented the Court of Aldermen of the City of London. The first meeting of the newly formed trustees took place on the 6th of February, a little over 2 weeks after the founder's death, and the first visitors were admitted by ticket on the 4th of April, 1837. You had to write for a ticket to gain admission, which I think was enough of a barrier that not that many people, after the original rush to see what it was like, took it up. Nevertheless, there was puzzlement among the public over the purpose of the museum, as well as the quixotic nature of Soane's architectural legacy. This issue was raised in 1837, the year in which the museum opened, by an article in the wonderful, I love this name, it's very Victorian, the penny magazine of the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. How could it fail with a title like that? While containing many admiring observations about the building, its interiors, and collection, which essentially were cribbed from the description, the privately printed description, the article echoes some of the points that were raised in the debate in Parliament 4 years earlier about the purpose of establishing such a museum. And I'll read you again some phrases, some sentences from this article. To admit the public indiscriminately into a small private house in the same way as they are admitted into the British Museum or any other national depository of art would not only be incurring the risk of loss and damage, but would be defeating the uses of the property. And what, it may be asked, is the practical use of Sir John Soane's house and museum? And to what extent, too, will it be considered proper to open the library to the artist and architectural student? These considerations affect the utility of the collection, and if only a limited few are permitted to have a practical use of the house and museum, Sir John Soane's intentions will be rendered inoperative. The trustees are anxious to fulfill their trust and to open the collection as far as possible to the public. The difficulty seems to be how to make proper arrangements consistently with the preservation and security of the property. The article may have been prompted by the large number of visitors who were drawn to the museum immediately after its open, but accessibility was and remains today a legitimate concern for a museum on the scale of the Soane. In point of fact, John Soane seems never to have thought through the disposition of areas within the house for public consultation or offices. Thus, as we have seen, it was not surprising that some 20 years after the article I just quoted, and after a precipitous drop in visitor numbers, the builder posed the same questions but more forcefully. It could be said that Sir John Soane's single-minded focus on preserving his house and collections unaltered posed insurmountable difficulties, but changes began occurring early on. For example, one of the most famous works in the collection, Hogarth's A Rake's Progress, was removed from the picture room and placed on folding stands in the south drawing room in 1849, remaining there until 1891. In addition, as you can probably make out, the ivory table and chairs believed to have been formerly in the possession of Tipu Sultan, the Sultan of Mysore, were moved to the same location in an effort to increase the circulation of visitors in the picture room. Visitor numbers in the early years hovered around 3,000, and opening hours changed frequently, much to the frustration of the general public. Indeed, many of the changes put into effect during the latter part of the 19th century were attempts to grapple with the issues of accessibility, and more particularly with lighting. James Wilde, who served as curator from 1878 until his death in 1893, went to great, even extreme lengths to ring the changes by building a new picture room at the back of number 12. And this is the new picture room as it looked in 1995. And you can probably appreciate here that it has the big canaletto, all three of our canalettos in there, including some plaster casts by Thomas Banks, the ivory chairs again, and the table in the middle of the room. The idea being that, again, some of the key elements in the collection would be more easily seen by the public. And this was built actually between 1889 and 1890 and necessitated demolishing whatever structure had been left there from Soane's day. We simply don't know what it was in order to decant some of the picture room's masterpieces into a more spacious setting. During this period, the Pompeian model stand was cut in half and moved to the north drawing room. Here we see it in a photograph around 1911. And the anteroom off the breakfast room was enlarged out of recognition and denuded of much of its contents. On the right, we see it as it was restored. Actually, and one of the first things that I oversaw in my time was the recreation of the proper proportions and decor of this antechamber off the breakfast room. Wilde went so far as to propose the removal of the drawing office, the oldest surviving architectural studio in the country, an essential piece. But he died before carrying this out, fortunately. Otherwise, the oldest surviving architectural studio in the country, an essential piece of the museum fabric, would have been lost. And this, in fact, is the last major restoration which we've conducted in the museum. And some of you have seen it, but if you haven't, it's well worth looking in on it the next time you're in London. On the eve of the 20th century, electricity was finally introduced into the Soane Museum, and this went some way towards answering the complaints of visitors like a German archaeologist, Adolf Michaelis, who complained about the incredibly inconvenient mode in which a great part of the contents of the Soane Museum are arranged so that the sculptures are scarcely within reach of the eye and in very narrow passages and very dark corners. But letting in the light threatened to rob areas like the crypt of the atmospherics that led Henry James to set one of his short stories there. He has his heroine, Laura Wing, sees a friend of hers and a man who is not her husband in the crypt during a thunderstorm. It's all very exciting. In addition, the Tivoli recess, which we see here, was converted into a lavatory in 1917 to meet the needs of the museum-going public. and it was only returned to its original state in 2012. Photography was introduced in the early 20th century by the then curator Arthur Bolton, and through the medium of the camera one can trace the metamorphoses of a room like the South Drawing Room on the first floor in European style. Here we see it around 1911, and you'll see that it's full of display cases which showed some of the manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts and drawings. On the wall between the South and North Drawing Room, there are engravings by John Mortimer of figures from Shakespeare, which have now been restored to their original place in Mrs. Soane's morning room on the second floor. So things were constantly in a state of flux during this period. And the same room looks virtually, in 1920 it was converted into a consultation room, so you see it has desks there, and on the far left you see a detail of the dance cabinet, which was a kind of ark that contained the drawings of his mentor, George Dance, which is now in its original place in the North Drawing Room. And the same room we see here as it looked in 1947 after its reopening after the Second World War. And the only way you can really identify it as the South Drawing Room is by the coffering in the ceiling. The reason, in fact, these bookcases, I should add, were made in the 1920s in imitation of the bookcases on the ground floor in the library dining room to give a sense of continuity of style. And they're now actually in number 14 in the library there, where they're used for consultation. And if we compare how it looked in 1947 with its appearance today, you can see that contrary to what John Soane wished, things were not left exactly as he wished in his day. Now, in the 20th century, particularly in the 1920s and 1930s, one can look at the minutes of the trustees' meetings, and one picks up quickly a defensive atmosphere about the restrictive number of opening days and the very purpose of the museum itself. The building and collection were informally restyled as Sir John Soane's House and Museum in the 1920s. And if you look at the letter paper, the heading was called Sir John Soane's House and Museum, although the title never became official. Still, it did speak to a dual mandate that the curator, Arthur Bolton, and the trustees were intent upon. The debate over the demolition of Soane's Bank of England in the mid-1920s stimulated public interest in the Soane Museum, and attendance in this period shot up to around 8,000 a year. And here we see a famous view of Soane's rotunda in the bank as it was being demolished in May of 1925. And initially the bank said that it was only going to demolish some of Soane's work, but in the end it demolished all of it in order to build a 9-story building inside the perimeter walls, which then as now were by Soane himself. And with the onset of the worldwide depression, the situation deteriorated from 1932 onwards, and loss of income effectively hampered any attempts at reform. Meanwhile, public criticism about the restrictive nature of the museum's operations continued. And here, of course, we're looking at Sir John Soane's bust by Chantry, which after the Act of Parliament in 1833, he had put here under the dome, flanked by statuettes of Michelangelo and Raphael by his friend John Flaxman, to suggest a kind of architectural genealogy of which he was part, if not the head or the summit. In 1938, the Soodley Committee, a blue ribbon panel which was concerned with making museums more accessible to the general public, had the Soane Museums in its sight. Its recommendations included making the opening hours more convenient to the public, as well as appointing a committee of museum experts to rearrange the contents of the Soane Museum so that they could be better seen. The committee made public its recommendations in a letter by its chairman, the Earl of Harwood, to the Times of the 11th of July, 1938, in which he expressed the hope that it may be possible, consistently with Sir John Soane's intentions, to afford further facilities to the general public, comparable with those of similar institutions open to the public. This prompted a question in Parliament by an MP, and a few days later, in a written reply, the government expressed its collective view that the museum, the Soane Museum, was a private foundation and demurred from asking Parliament to intervene in its management. 1 year later, on the 26th of July, 1939, Lord Harwood again wrote to the Times, expressing disappointment that the trustees of Sir John Soane's Museum had not made any efforts to carry out the recommendations in the report, concluding, "It seems anomalous that the provisions of an Act of Parliament of 1833 should be allowed to hamper a museum of great potential usefulness, both for students of architecture and the general public." This provoked a reply in the Times of the 3rd of August, 1939, by the chairman of the Soane trustees at the time, the architect and author Sir Reginald Blomfield. He countered these criticisms by arguing point by point, 1, that the trustees are strictly bound by the terms of Sir John Soane's bequest to maintain the museum in exactly the state at which he left it at his death, and the Act of 1833 was, in fact, the act embodying that bequest. 2, that the greatly extended facilities desired by the committee are beyond the financial resources of the Soane Trust. If the Sudeley Committee will provide the necessary funds, the Soane trustees will gladly see what can be done to meet their views. But I must point out, he continued, that the Sudeley Committee seems to have misconceived the position of Sir John Soane's Museum. It is not a public museum supported by the taxpayer, but a private museum established and maintained by a specific bequest. Blomfield's argument was somewhat disingenuous, since many changes, as we've seen, had taken place in the building and its displays after the death of its founder. Yet the letter does illuminate a groupthink of those governing the Soane Museum in this period, and the rather narrow view taken of the mandate in the Act of Parliament concerning the benefit of the public. And to a remarkable degree, the debates over the purpose of the Soane Museum in the 1930s echoed those around the foundation of the British Museum in the 1750s, when the concept of a public museum, and indeed of a public, were still a novelty. The Second World War put an end to this stalemate. In 1939, it was decided that the principal books and paintings were to be removed from the Soane for storage with works from the British Museum and the National Gallery. Serious bomb damage occurred in and around the museum in 1940, which necessitated the closure of the Soane for the remainder of the war. The evacuation of books, drawings, and furniture and marbles continued through 1941 and 1942. And eventually, at the end of hostilities, John Summerson was appointed curator in succession to Arthur Bolton, and his first task was to assess the damage and outline steps for recovery. And here we see Summerson in the breakfast room towards the end of his 40-year reign as curator and director in 1984. Summerson's first task was to assess the damage and outline steps for recovery. He addressed a memorandum to the trustees on the 13th of June, 1945, in which he underscored the precarious situation of the building. After nearly 6 years of war, he wrote, with repeated damage by enemy action and inadequate maintenance, the house and galleries are in very poor condition. He proposed a plan to repair and reglaze the house and galleries with redecoration, following as finances allowed. During this period, the museum remained closed to the general public, only reopening in September of 1947. The Pilgrim Trust gave 2 grants towards the reinstatement and repair of the museum in 1945 and 1946. At the same time, Summerson submitted a memorandum on the financial future of the Soane Museum to the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hugh Dalton, and this led to an initial annual grant of £2,250, which was just sufficient to keep the museum open for 240 days a year, or 5 days a week from Tuesday through Saturday. In this way, the Soane Museum was formally brought into the network of national museums. The restoration of the Soane Museum as we know it today actually began largely through the efforts of Sir John Summerson, who remained in post until 1984. He laid the foundations for changing what has been described as an agreeable, if largely inaccessible, curiosity into a small museum of international repute. Although Summerson's initial objectives were to restore the parlous condition of the building's fabric and to look for an augmented endowment, he diplomatically prodded the trustees to reconsider the policy and functioning of the museum. As he wrote in his memorandum of 1945, during nearly the whole of its existence, the museum has been subject to criticism for its failure to render an adequate service to students and to exhibit its material in a worthy manner to the public. Although recent attacks revealed a certain misunderstanding of the nature of the trust and its limitations under the Act of 1833, there is no question that a policy of sympathetic and progressive reform can be and must be pursued to establish the museum in public esteem. Gradually, during his long tenure, Summerson steered a course that made the Soane more accessible to the still nascent discipline of British architectural history, as well as to the public at large. At the same time, he engineered another important stage in the restoration of number 13, which was number 13 Lincoln's Inn Field, by persuading the trustees to reoccupy number 12, which had previously been let for income. And here you can see the three buildings as they constitute the museum today. Strictly speaking, it's only number 12 on the left and number 13 in the middle that are the museum. Number 14, which was acquired in 1996, is not, strictly speaking, part of the museum, but it was crucial to the restoration of the museum. Summerson persuaded the trustees to reoccupy number 12 in 1969, and the net effect expanded the museum's capacity by decanting workspaces from the fabric of number 13, and this policy of restoration continued under the curatorship of his successor, Peter Thornton, who was in office from 1984 to 1995. Peter Thornton came well prepared for this task, as he had specialized in the study of historic interiors during his years as keeper of the Department of Furniture and Woodwork at the Victoria and Albert Museum. He embarked on the first phase of restoring the interiors of Soane to their original appearance by painting the first floor drawing rooms, the brilliant yellow and bronze green seen in this watercolor by C.J. Richardson of 1835. Now, this was controversial at the time, and I can remember standing in this room with Peter Thornton, and he explained to me that this was the original color, and it was a color that was very popular in the early 19th century, and you can see similarly colored rooms at Apsley House, the town house of the Duke of Wellington, among other places. And this change to bring the room back as nearly as possible to its appearance under Soane's day set in motion a movement for further restoration, a movement that proved unstoppable. Julian Harrop architects were brought in as consultants in 1989 and have remained essential collaborators of the museum for over 30 years. During the 1990s, the picture room, the Shakespeare recess, the study room, and dressing room were brought back to their original appearances and proportions, and the Tivoli recess, which we saw a few moments ago, was recreated after its dismantling in 1917. The work begun by Peter Thornton has continued ever since. In 1996, the trustees were finally able to purchase the freehold of number 14, thanks to a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund. Its acquisition enabled the reestablishment of the fine Soanian interiors of that house. he bought the house and rebuilt it between 1822 and 1824, and the yard behind the house was turned into the picture room in the monk's parlor in the monk's yard. Now it's used for the research library, the Atom Study Center, which contains our collection of atom drawings, and offices as well. The purchase of number 14 paved the way for a 7-year campaign, which was referred to as Opening Up the Soane, which went on from 2009 to 2016. This complex project had a number of interrelated goals, and we're looking here on number 12 at the reconstruction of number 12 during this period. In addition to restoring historic rooms and opening them to the public, it improved visitor facilities in terms of new cloakrooms, a shop, and a gallery in number 12. And here we're looking at the galleries which were opened on the first floor, European style, in 2012. The addition of 2 conservation studios at the same time enabled work to be done in a much more professional manner than heretofore. Before these conservation studios were opened, the conservators used a sink, which was also used by the staff for washing up their lunch. We also were able to introduce disabled access to the museum as a whole in number 12. Most remarkably, as fruit of this movement, Opening Up the Soane, the private apartments, which had been converted into offices, as you can see here, were returned to their original appearance. And here we see on the left a view of the morning room as it was in the 1990s when it was Helen Dorey's office, and after its restoration in 2015. What is missing in this photograph is the carpet, which was again recreated based on Soane's watercolors made for Soane of the room. And here we're looking at the model room, which again, in the 19th century was converted into offices, and then during this period it was reconstituted based upon watercolors and also engravings of the room as it appeared in the 1830s. All of this was brought to a successful conclusion in 2016-2017, thanks to an initial grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund and the museum raising £7 million. These changes and the expansion of the footprint coincided with a steady increase in the number of visitors, which rose from around 10,000 in the 1950s to 20,000 in the 1970s, and over 135,000 in our last fiscal year, which ended in March. Throughout this period of reconstruction and restoration, the challenge remained reconciling improvements with the idiosyncratic character and unique atmosphere of the Soane Museum. One of the ways in which we could address this was, of course, digital, which has become increasingly important as a means of raising our profile and enabling visitors to savor some of the glories of our collection. We had a campaign in which virtually all of our 40,000 objects are now online, most of them with images. And this shows you a screenshot with a view of the bust of Sir John Soane, some thumbnail descriptions, and then also links to other pages. We also created a fly-through, which actually was dormant after 2012 for a number of years, but then during the pandemic, when the museum was shut down, it gained favorable notice, including in the New York Times, and this led to our building upon what we had done by including the picture room, which you can see here, which was added to it in 2022. So now you can, from the convenience of your home or wherever you are, enter the picture room and look at any of the 118 works of art on the walls, and you will click on them and you'll get, again, a thumbnail description of the work in question, in this case, one of Gandhi's, the architectural visions of early fancy in the gay morning of youth, which is academic studies by the young John Soane. So, looking back from our vantage point, one can detect a synchronicity between the rehabilitation of Sir John Soane's museum and the rehabilitation of Soane's reputation as an architect. The latter took a century to achieve, for throughout the 19th century, Soane's work was damned with faint praise, or simply damned as willfully eccentric. At the same time, the museum was saved from complete marginalization by the revival of interest in Soane as an architect in the early 20th century. The 100th anniversary of Soane's death in 1937 saw a further rise in public consciousness, and both modernists and postmodernists alike can look to Soane as a spiritual godfather, one whose eclecticism of style and rule-breaking gave younger architects permission to experiment in a similar vein. The continuing reassessment of Soane gave weight to the parallel movement to restore his house and collection to a closer approximation of their original appearance. The restoration of Soane's properties in Lincoln's Inn Field has enabled us to appreciate what he called studies for my own mind more clearly than ever, even if there is no one key to it all. Most people today, I think, would agree that it is fortunate the museum was not reorganized along conventional lines or according to chronological genres in the last century as the Soudley Committee and others proposed. Moreover, it's doubtful that many would endorse the German archaeologist Michaelis's lapidary dismissal of the Soane collection as non multum sed multa, not much but a lot in English. For it is easy to see the forest and miss the trees. With the benefits of hindsight, we can recognize that the 19th century concept of a museum as a systematic and chronologically organized presentation of objects, a concept that prevailed well into the 20th century, is only one way of looking at history. Our renewed interest in the history of museums and of the cabinets of curiosity from which the modern museum emerged reflects a desire to pursue diverse epistemological paths and to reconsider the museum per se as an archaeological site worthy of exploration. In this way, one could say that the 21st century has caught up with Sir John Soane. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. It's almost a time to have cocktails, but if there's one or two questions, Bruce might be able to.
Yes, back there?
You showed an image of the new picture room. Where exactly is that?
It's the other side of the galleries from the picture room, and it is now called the foil space. It's where we have part of our temporary exhibitions. It was where Soane had his first architectural studio. It's in the back of what is number 12. In 1819, he turned it into the first picture room, and we know what it looked like because there's an engraving of it by Pugin that was published in 1825, even as he was transferring everything to the picture room that we know today. And whatever happened to it, it was just, I think, left until 1889, 1890, when James Wilde, who was as I said, very interventionist curator, demolished what was there and created a kind of Edwardian gallery for the purpose of taking some of the works out of the picture room and putting them in there. And they were reinstalled in the picture room by Tim Knox. Yeah. Yes, Wendy.
Have you left anything for your successor to do?
Raise money. No, there's always something to do. With 3 buildings, which are starred Grade 1 listed buildings, we have constant challenges. We have 18 skylights, so whenever it rains, we have leaks. No, well, I mean, no, they aren't new, but it used to be that you could use lead paint on them, which helped keep the water out, but we can't do that anymore. And for instance, when we paint the facades, paint the balconies, etc., of the facade, we have to put up scaffolding that doesn't touch the building. So it becomes, even more expensive. Doing anything inside the rooms themselves, again, is very costly for the same sort of reasons. But there are corners here and there that could be changed. But I think basically it is as close to Sir John's day as we can get it. And it's largely really my predecessors. The two things that I did were oversaw the installation of the anteroom off the breakfast room, and then the drawing office. And I have to say that the foundation played a great role in giving us the first money towards this, which served as a catalyst for our raising, in the end, £650,000. So, yes, Stephanie.
When you painted the yellow drawing room upstairs, did you actually find the successive that specific color in the
Yeah, well, Peter Thornton, whom I knew relatively well, was a pioneer of doing paint analysis. When he was keeper of furniture at the V&A, the V&A owned Osterley House, which had been renovated by Robert Adam in the 1760s, and he repainted the ceilings according to the color schemes that he found through doing these analyses. The unfortunate thing was, of course, he had to use conventional paints. There was no Farrow and Ball, none of that sort of thing. So they looked really a bit off, but it was he was pioneering in that way. And he pointed out to me as we were standing in that room, I'll never forget it, that this was the original color, and they'd done paint analysis, and that you could see the same thing in Apsley House and some other houses of the same period. And the other thing he pointed out was that Soane spent an enormous amount of money each year regilding the frames on his paintings. And as I've said before, the only conclusion one can draw from this is that Soane loved bling.
Did they end up using Farrow Ball in the yellow room?
If not Farrow and Ball, I think in some cases, but there are other companies now that do the same thing. And there's another one called Britain, which we used for the last repainting of the south drawing room, the north and south drawing rooms. And it was 1984 was when they were converted to their original appearance, and they had been left that way until just a year or two ago, well, 18 months ago. So we had, they were getting very shabby. And I mean, the next thing we need to do is to redo the curtains, which are beginning to show signs of wear and tear. And also, we have a chandelier in the south drawing room, which I think Tim Knox got from John Lewis on Oxford Street. So we'd like to find a period one,
I think we should move into the room.
Okay.
And you can ask Bruce questions inside with a drink. Bruce, we always learn so much from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.